And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is March the 4th, the 63rd day of the year. Just 302 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll go start a new one. Holidays observances. National Dance the Waltz Day. World Obesity Day. Maintaining a healthy weight can be somewhat challenging, but a balanced diet and regular exercise can improve physical health and mental well-being. National Snack Day. Brain Injury Awareness Day. National Pound Cake Day. National Sons Day. HPV Awareness Day. International Game Master Day. National Hug a GI Day. I can get behind that one. International Scrapbooking Industry Day. Benjamin Harrison Day. Toy Soldier Day. Stepping into the shoes of medical saviors, adventure seekers, and brave defenders. It's all about dressing up and living the fantasy. Marching Band Day. Holy Experiment Day. Stop Bad Service Day. National Backcountry Ski Day. National Grammar Day. Courageous Follower Day. World Day of Fight Against Sexual Exploitation. Do Something Day. Old Inauguration Day. Learn What Your Name Means Day. World Engineering Day for Sustainable Development. Adelaide Fringe. Teen Tech Week. Libraries evolve with technology, offering digital tools and resources for research and learning and exploration beyond books. Peace Corps Week. Self-Storage Week. Termite Awareness Week. Read Across America Week. Make Mine Chocolate No More Week. National Professional Pet Sitters Week. Women in Aviation Week. Women in Construction Week. Read an ebook week. Since I've written so many ebooks, I'm really pushing that one. Butcher's Week. British Pie Week. National Consumer Protection Week. World Orphan Week. National Invest in Veterans Week. School Breakfast Week. Dental Assisted Recognition Week. Newspaper and Education Week. Chocolate Chip Cookie Week. National Ghostwriters Week. That's another one that I think is great because I've been a ghostwriter. National Scoot to School Week. Will Eisner Week. The Godfather of Graphic Novels. Hearing Awareness Week. National Aplastic Anemia and MDS Awareness Week. Celebrate Your Name Week. World Words Matter Week. Cheerleading Week. National School Social Work Week. Telecommuter Appreciation Week. National Green Week. North Dakota Winter Show. Jewish Book Week. Explore the rich literary tradition of the Jewish people. Write a Letter Appreciation Week. Return Borrowed Books Week. National Procrastination Week. Universal Human Beings Week. And it's Ramadan until March 19th. The Muslim Holy Month, when they fast from sunrise to sunset, focusing on spiritual reflection and community. Famous people born on this date: Bobby Christina Brown and Catherine O'Hara. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news, because it's always something going on. Well, Israel has warning for whoever's chosen to replace the dead Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In other words, they could be next. Iranian barrages test the Satellite Interceptor reserves as the U.S. sounds alarm for Americans in that region. Iran is continuing a steady stream of missile attacks against U.S. allied nations in the region as Operation Epic Fury enters its fourth day on yesterday. Today's the fifth day, of course. The the U.S. An Israel assault on Iran entered its fourth day Tuesday. President Trump saying the plan is ahead of schedule. Excuse me. Thanks to early elimination of Iran's top leaders. The U.S. has urged Americans to leave 14 countries across the Middle East as Iran's counterattacks intensify. U.S. State Department's closed 2 embassies in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The Gulf Cooperation Council warned Iran to take all necessary measures, including possible military action in response to Tehran's missile and drone attacks. Well, Israel is warned that Iran's next supreme leader is going to be a target for elimination. Beyond the Iran deal, while President Trump's refusal to kick the can just saved generations. National security experts of the deep state called him unqualified when he sought the presidency in 2016. They said he was reckless. Some 50 former GOP national security officials said he'd put at risk our country's national security. And even one former Secretary of Defense called him a cavalier about the use of nuclear weapons. Turns out they really didn't know much about President Trump. They didn't understand that he viewed keeping the American people safe as his top priority. As Commander-in-Chief, they didn't grasp his commitment to ensure that the world's #1 sponsor of terrorism, a radical Islamist regime that vowed death to America, would never acquire a nuclear weapon. Well, the free world has long been concerned about Iran's nuclear program, and its their nuclear ambitions, when combined with the ever-increasing range of its ballistic missile capability, that poses the greatest threat. Now, over the years, steps have been undertaken to try and delay or slow down Iran's nuclear efforts. The Stuxnet cyber attack in 2010 destroyed a lot of spinning centrifuges in Iran's Natanz facility. Experts believe this set Iran's nuclear program back about 2 years. And regardless of these efforts, though, Iran would always reconstitute and expand its nuclear program, thumbing its nose at the International Atomic Energy Agency along the way. In 2015, a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran Deal as it was called, was negotiated with the U.S. government's support and supported a vast majority of national security experts who opposed Trump's candidacy in 2016. Well, he was a better negotiator than they'd expected. Well, the Pentagon has identified 4 soldiers killed on March 1st in a drone strike during Kuwait military operations. Department of War on Monday identified 4 of the 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers killed March 1st during a drone attack in Kuwait while supporting Operation Epic Fury. Officials said the incident remains under investigation. Soldiers were killed at the port of Shu'aiba, doing what officials described as a unmanned aircraft system attack. All are assigned to the 103rd Sustainment Command in Des Moines, Iowa, which provides logistical and operational support to U.S. forces overseas. Fallen service members were identified as Captain Cody Cork, 35, of Lakeland, Florida. Sergeant First Class Nicole Lamore, 39, of White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Sergeant First Class Noah Tejins, 42, of Bellevue, Nebraska. And Sergeant Declan Cody, 20, of Des Moines, Iowa. 2 additional soldiers killed in the attack have not yet been publicly identified. Lieutenant General Robert Hartner, Chief of the Army Reserve and Commanding General of the U.S. Army Reserve Command, said the loss is deeply felt across the force. He said, "We honor our fallen heroes who served fearlessly and selflessly in defense of our nation. Their sacrifice and the sacrifices of their families never be forgotten." Well, rising star Tellerico has toppled progressive firebrand Crockett in a high-stakes Texas Senate Democratic primary. James Tellerico, a Democratic state lawmaker from Texas with a surging national profile, defeated Representative Jasmine Crockett, nationally known politician, progressive firebrand, and vocal critic and foil of President Trump to win the Democratic state primary in Texas, according to the Associated Press. Tallarico's 36, will now try to become the first Democrat in nearly 4 decades to win a Senate election in Texas, as he faces off against the winner of a bruising Republican primary, a runoff between longtime incumbent Senator John Cornyn and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. This year's Senate showdown in Texas is one of a handful across the country that could determine if Republicans hold their majority in the chamber of the midterm elections. GOP currently controls the chamber 53-47. In the final weeks leading up to yesterday's Democratic primary, race became a key factor in the showdown between Tallarico, a former middle school teacher and Presbyterian seminarian who's considered a rising star among Democrats, and Crockett, a civil rights attorney first elected to Congress in 2022. Well, maybe she will be a little less quick to start mouthing into the press, though I doubt it. Dan Crenshaw defeated by Cruz-backed state lawmaker in Texas GOP primary, boosting the MAGA clout. 4-term Representative Dan Crenshaw, Republican of Texas, lost his Republican primary battle Tuesday to Steve Toth, a state representative and businessman, after years of turmoil between Crenshaw and the MAGA faction of the Republican Party that questions Crenshaw's loyalty to Trump. Second congressional district primary that ended Tuesday with Toth beating out Crenshaw drew a sharp line in the Republican Party. Crenshaw wasn't formally endorsed by President Trump or Texas Governor Greg Abbott. Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, endorsed Toth after reportedly got into a tilt with Crenshaw at the airport over whether the senator was working against the representative's reelection. And in the Tuesday's primary, Toth positioned himself as a more loyal conservative, comparing Crenshaw to a version of Liz Cheney, who, when in Congress, found herself frequently at odds with Trump before exiting public office. Well, we'll see if things settle down among Republicans. Well, a Minnesota police sergeant, father of 2, died suddenly after a brain infection. Minnesota police sergeant died less than 24 hours after doctors diagnosed him with a brain infection, leaving behind a young family and a stunned community. Sergeant Cody Siebert, a canine officer with the East Range Police Department, died February 27th, the department announced. Remembered as a devoted father, loyal colleague, and a fixture in a small northern Minnesota community he served. Siebert helped launch the canine program in Babbitt, Minnesota, alongside his police dog, Taconite, before later joining the East Range Police Department. Sergeant Siebert was well known for his happy-go-lucky personality, according to the department. Best said that if you couldn't get along with Cody, it was your fault. The hold-up of Sergeant Siebert's passing is going to be impossible to fill, according to the department. A GoFundMe page launched by Siebert's family has raised more than $107,000 as of Tuesday evening. Survived by his life partner, Karen Blaise, and their 2 sons, ages 1 and 2. The known Cody was to have a friend. He had a rare gift for connection. If you crossed paths with him, you knew you were in for a genuine conversation. Truly enjoyed people. His absence leaves a void in our community to be felt by many, according to his family. New details have exposed how a former top Trump official got caught in Epstein's web of influence. A trove of newly released Jeffrey Epstein documents has shed fresh light on the vast network of influential relationships that the late disgraced financier carefully cultivated over decades. Most prominently in South Florida, where Epstein's ties allowed him to curry favor and win preferential treatment from the very individuals tasked with holding him accountable. Democrats published under the Epstein Transparency Act detail the links that Epstein went to in order to cultivate a coterie of powerful relationships, including in Florida and within the Justice Department itself, where Alex Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, go on to negotiate and approve a highly unusual sweetheart deal on Epstein's behalf. Yes, a lot of things are still coming to light. Well, 2 young identified black girls were found dead inside a buried suitcase in Ohio. Police in Cleveland asking the public for tips after 2 young black girls were found dead inside of separate suitcases buried in shallow graves on Monday. Cleveland Police Chief Dorothy Todd said during a news conference that the girls, believed to be between the ages of 8 and 13 and 10 and 14, were found Monday evening. Discovery was made Monday evening after a man walking his dog near East 167th Street and Midland Avenue in a field near Jen Academy found a partially buried suitcase and called police. Police responded and located a shallow grave and found a deceased individual inside the suitcase. After canvassing the area, the police found a second shallow grave and another suitcase containing a second individual. The man who discovered one of the suitcases told Fox News his dog ran toward a fence near a playground where the partially buried suitcase was found. Said he called police after he unzipped the suitcase and saw a head inside. Girls haven't been identified. Authorities haven't determined the cause of death yet. There's no active missing person reports in Cleveland matching the victims, according to police, and it wasn't clear how long the girls had been inside the suitcases. Yeah, let's see what else we got. Landman star Adley Larder celebrates her 50th birthday with bikini photos from what was called a paradise getaway. She's ringing in a new decade with a bang. In a recent Instagram post, the Landman star shared photos of her 50th birthday celebration in paradise. Post featured a lot of pictures of the actress with her friends and a few bikini shots. On the eve of her big birthday, she said, loved ones gathered for an unforgettable weekend in my happy place. Huge thank you to our incredible friends and husband for planning this and making me feel so special. She was overwhelmed by the joy and laughter and shared love and beautiful connections. One for the memory books, heart is overflowing. One photo, she shows off her toned abs in a white bikini with a crochet cover-up skirt, posing on a wooden deck with stairs leading to the ocean behind her. Well, Noem preps to battle House Democrats after bipartisan bashing in the Senate over dogs and ICE. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem heads into a second straight day of high-stakes Capitol Hill combat today, this time facing House Democrats eager to press her on ICE arrest and warrantless operations in the Trump administration's mass deportation push. All as a partial shutdown clouds her agency. After sparring with Senate Democrats over DACA arrest and Election Day enforcement, she now enters a House Judiciary hearing stacked with vocal critics from Representative Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland, and Representative Jasmine Crockett, Democrat of Texas, setting up another marathon session over immigration enforcement and executive power. Democrats are determined. If you say you can't speak English, you're definitely somebody that needs to be here. Well, timeline tracks a diplomat's path from college overachiever to alleged highway road rage mass stabber. Diplomat accused of fatally stabbing one person and injuring 3 others in a Sunday highway road rage incident, once graduated with academic honors and built a career that took him to the U.S. State Department. Jared Lamato, 32, fatally stabbed Michelle Adams, 39, and injured Dana Bonnell, 36, Macy Flood, 37, and Heather Miller, 40, according to the Virginia State Police. He also stabbed his own dog to death, according to authorities. Incident happened on I-495 southbound at 1:17 p.m. in Fairfax County, about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. Officials said the stabbing didn't appear to be targeted, and none of the victims beside the dog were in Lamato's car at the time. Lamato, who was armed with a knife, was shot by a state trooper in self-defense and died at a local hospital. The trooper was not injured. It's a sad thing that the dog had to go. Well, Waymo autonomous car blocks an ambulance crew responding to a deadly Austin mass shooting. Footage captured a startling moment when a Waymo self-driving vehicle briefly blocked Austin ambulance crews rushing to the scene of Sunday's deadly mass shooting. The incident occurred about 2 in the morning at a popular entertainment hub where a gunman fatally shot 3 people and wounded 13 more. In the footage, the Waymo car comes to a sideways stop in the road as an ambulance heads up the street with flashing lights. As the vehicle appeared slow to react and intermittently moving and stopping, visibly distressed witnesses shouted at it to move. Minutes later, an Austin police car arrives and an officer enters the Waymo vehicle, driving it into a nearby garage. Company told Fox News in the wake of the shooting, a Waymo car had been hailed by a rider for pickup when it identified a road blockage, began executing a U-turn. As the ambulance appeared mid-turn, the car then briefly yielded and was assisted by a nearby officer. Well, these self-driving cars still have occasional issues. There's no question about that. Well, former mayor was caught in a lewd act at a booze-filled pool party, according to prosecutors. Former Louisiana mayor's on trial after prosecutors allege her teenage son caught her having sex with one of his 16-year-old friends at a booze-filled pool party. Misty Roberts, 43, the former mayor of DeRider, is facing charges of carnal knowledge of a juvenile and indecent behavior with a juvenile, according to KPLC. She, of course, pled not guilty. Roberts' second trial is underway after the first case resulted in a mistrial due to judicial issues in nearby Beauregard Parish, according to the outlet. Charges stem from a 2024 late-night gathering at Roberts' home. Last week, her children and her ex-husband took the stand in her trial, along with a DoorDash driver, family friend, and multiple teenagers who were present at the party. Jurors were shown a video interview of Robert's son taken last year in which the teenager repeatedly told authorities he witnessed his mother having sex with his friend through a crack in a window during the party. However, upon taking a stand last week, the teenager reportedly told jurors he wasn't certain of what he actually saw that evening. Robert's defense attorney disputed the recording, telling jurors that part of the interview could have been improperly transcribed. Well, according to Laura Ingram, all the real conflicts are bubbling up, as if we don't have enough going on. Well, one last story. Comer's going to say Tim Walz has enabled fraud. Failed whistleblowers in a bombshell Minnesota hearing. House Oversight Committee Republicans are readying to confront Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and State Attorney General Keith Ellison in a high-stakes hearing on welfare fraud this morning. While Governor Walz hesitated, taxpayers lost billions. Attorney General Ellison had likewise claimed his office was aggressively holding fraudsters accountable, but when his statements were tested against the record, they fell apart. That's according to Chairman James Comer, Republican of Kentucky, according to prepared opening remarks obtained by Fox News. Well, that finishes our news segment. You know, we've been talking this week about government programs, some of which you've heard about and some you haven't. Yesterday we talked about Operation Paperclip in some detail. Today we're going to talk about some CIA programs that have been in and out of the news over the last decades, one of which is called MKULTRA. That's the CIA mind control experiment. There was one safe house, it turned out, that was in Greenwich Village. It was a red brick house, very narrow stairs, a stoop shaded by an iron railing. But inside that house, behind blackout curtains and triple locked doors, a experiment was underway. It was described later like a hospital disguised as an apartment. There was a mirror on the wall that didn't reflect light. Apparently it was a two-way mirror. Well, the victim of that experiment, whose name was Peter Walls, didn't notice that part. He followed his instructions. He arrived late. The man had opened the door and introduced himself just as Bob. None of the handlers who operated the facility actually gave their real or full names. Bob wore thick glasses, chain-smoked cigarettes, never blinked when he smiled. He had Peter Walls sit down on the couch. Jazz was playing on the radio. Miles Davis. But even that sounded a little contrived. Well, Bob gave Peter a glass of alcohol. He was told it was bourbon. And Peter took a sip and said later it burned a little more than usual. But 20 minutes later, the edge of the room started to ripple. Peter blinked and tried to focus, and Bob was still talking. Carrying on a spiel that Peter had trouble following. The words no longer made sense. They drifted apart. He rubbed his eyes and said, "I feel strange," and Bob responded, "Good." And that was the first warning Peter had that something was going on. See, one of the key factors about the experiments on the MKUltra, the victims of the experiments didn't know they were being experimented on. Peter agreed to participate in what he was told was a psychological endurance study for national defense. He was a junior analyst with, I guess you could say, a vague clearance and boring desk job at Langley. Nothing ever happened fast in the Langley atmosphere. If you ever worked for the government, it's like everything moves in slow motion. When he volunteered for the program, they told him it was a chance to serve his country without leaving the country. He said later they used words like enhanced perception and resilience training and adaptive threat conditioning. Said at no time was he ever told he'd be given drugs. And then he said as he sat there holding that glass of what he was told was bourbon, he said the wallpaper started breathing. Well, he clutched the arms of the couch trying to steady himself, but he said his hands didn't feel like his own anymore. They stretched too long and too thin, and Bob was sitting in a corner scribbling in a notebook as he continued his spiel. And behind the mirror, somebody else was watching as well. Peter could feel it, couldn't see it, but he knew their gaze was on him, peeling back layers and cataloging reactions. And finally, he whispered to Bob, "Where am I?" Bob said, "You're here." And that was the second warning. Then came the panic. It rose from his chest like a fire, consuming thought and breath. He couldn't swallow. The lights were too bright, the walls too close. He stood up and tried to walk, but the floor dropped away beneath him. He said the hallway looked like a tunnel. Sounds became geometry, hard, angular notes that sliced through his skull. He turned to leave, and he said the door was gone. Only the mirror remained. And in it he saw a version of himself he didn't recognize, pale and sweating and pupils blown wide. And that reflection smiled at him even though he wasn't smiling. Well, at that point he screamed, and Bob was happily taking notes. For hours passed, or maybe days, Peter couldn't tell anymore. He remembered somebody touching his arm, another needle, another cup of water laced with something sweeter. Said he vomited once and cried twice. At some point he wet himself. Nobody reacted to that. Next morning he guessed it was morning. He woke up on a cot in a windowless room with a flickering light bulb overhead. Said his mouth felt dry as ash and tried to stand up. The world tilted. He was having tremors. A man in a gray suit entered and sat down beside him. Man said, "We've learned a lot. You're doing very important work." Then the man gave him a file with no name on it, just a number, subject 28B. He said, "Read it when you're stronger. You'll be debriefed soon, but this was valuable. You've been a tremendous help." Well, Peter wanted to ask what had happened, but what he'd said, and if all this was going to stop, but all he could say was, "Why me?" Man stood up and said, "Because you fit the profile." And then the man in the suit left. Weeks later, people returned to his desk in Langley. Nobody asked where he'd been. He received accommodation in his file, stopped sleeping. He flinched at the fluorescent lights. Sometimes in elevators, heard jazz music, even though there was none playing. And his reflection in the mirror didn't always blink when he did. Well, he later learned that particular safe house he'd gone to was one of many the CIA ran. And the drugs, mostly LSD, sometimes mixed with barbiturates or stimulants, were administered without consent to dozens of others: soldiers, students, inmates, patients in psychiatric wards. All part of a project with a name nobody said out loud: MKULTRA. The goal wasn't treatment, it wasn't healing, it was control. Well, by 1995, the experiments had metastasized. What began in anonymous safe houses now crept into institutions cloaked in legitimacy. State hospitals, university labs, federal prisons. Subs exchanged. Some were prisoners, promised shorter sentences in exchange for participation in research. Others were psychiatric patients, already broken, easily dismissed if they screamed. And a few were college students, lured by flyers and cash stipends, never told what they were truly ingesting. They all became numbers. In Lexington, Kentucky, the U.S. narcotics farm, a bizarre hybrid of prison and hospital, heroin addicts were fed LSD for days on end. One man described a session where his arm stretched across the room, disintegrated, and reassembled inside a tunnel of fire. When he cried out, a man in a lab coat simply took notes and asked how long did the fire last. Well, the powers that be called this research. In Montreal, under the banner of therapeutic psychiatry, Dr. Ewan Cameron took MKUltra funding through a front organization. He was a prestigious figure, head of the Allen Memorial Institute. Patients came to him for help with depression, anxiety, postpartum trauma. He gave them electric shocks far beyond standard limits and played loops of recorded messages while they were comatose from sedatives. Over and over, those recorded messages said, "You're a failure, you're worthless, you're nothing." Well, when questioned, Cameron said it was called psychic driving. Some of the patients forgot their own names. One woman who entered the clinic for mild postpartum depression left unable to speak, unable to feed herself, her memory wiped down to childhood. Her husband described her as a ghost in her own skin. When he asked Cameron what had happened, the doctor said it was just her fragility that led to this. He never mentioned the CIA. Inside Langley, the walls closed tighter. Project MKUltra was now directed by Sidney Gottlieb, a man as brilliant as he was untraceable. Chemist with a club foot and a penchant for Buddhist poetry. He believed the key to mind control was in dismantling identity. He didn't trust paperwork. He avoided hierarchy. His orders were often verbal, his signatures rarely used. But through it all, the money flowed. Gottlieb's team operated through show organizations, college grants, research fellowships. Nobody asked any questions. The Cold War had birthed a religion of paranoia, and the high priests were bureaucrats with black budgets. They feared the Soviets were developing truth serums and memory erasers and psychic assassins. And so we had to do it as well. Everything was justified by the fear of being second. In one experiment, a young man was dosed with LSD for 77 consecutive days. 77. Lost the ability to distinguish dreams from life. When he's finally released, he jumped in front of a subway train in Baltimore. The agency, of course, didn't take any responsibility. Deaths in this program were common. They just didn't make the reports. Instead, the files focused on behavioral elasticity, memory plasticity, and hypnotic responsiveness. Now, there was a different individual who gained some notoriety. His name was Frank Olson. He was a bacteriologist working at Fort Detrick, involved in biological weapons research. In 1953, he attended a CIA retreat at Deep Creek Lake. Without his knowledge, he was slipped LSD by his colleagues as part of an informal trial. Days later, he began to unravel. Told his wife he felt his mind was breaking. He confided to a friend that he'd seen too much. November 28th, he fell, or perhaps was pushed, from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. Official reports said it was suicide. But of course, that's the default solution to any unexplained death. But an examination of the body said something else. When Olson's family began asking questions, they were stonewalled. Years later, in the 1990s, his son exhumed the body. Autopsy revealed no signs of defensive wounds on his arms because he hadn't braced himself for the fall. Literally been unconscious when he hit the pavement. Injuries to his skull didn't match a fall. They actually matched blunt force trauma. CIA called it a tragedy. Well, the documents are harder to find now. Gottlieb had ordered a lot of the MKUltra archive destroyed in 1973. This is whispers of exposure began to surface, and whistleblowers were becoming quite active. He told aides to burn the most sensitive material. It remained as fragmented. Financial reports, stray memos, redacted reports. A skeleton of something that was once quite vast. But even those fragments spoke volumes. One memo listed payments to a brothel in San Francisco where CIA agents observed unsuspecting men through two-way mirrors while dosing them with LSD. It was called Operation Midnight Climax. Prostitutes were paid to lure the targets in. The agents drank cocktails behind the glass, taking notes as the men unraveled. Some of them never left. Others left convinced they'd gone mad. The irony was brutal. A program designed to erase free will and been built on the complete absence of consent. There were no informal forms. No informed forms either. No disclosures, no legal review. The agency justified it all with a phrase repeated in classified briefings. The enemy doesn't ask permission. And so, neither did they. By the late 60s, MKUltra was no longer a single project. It was a constellation of horror stretched across the country. Dozens of sub-projects, each with its own code name, its own victims, its own brand of silence. And the casualties were mounting, not just in bodies, but in minds. In families that would never know what broke their sons, and patients who vanished into institutions and never came back. The truth was still buried, but now cracks are beginning to form. It began as many reckonings do, with a mistake. 1974, following a wave of post-Watergate reforms, the Freedom of Information Act was strengthened. A year later, a clerk in the CIA's financial archives uncovered a batch of misfiled documents, budget logs, payment requests, reimbursement forms. These were boring bureaucratic forms, but they bore strange notations, references to Subproject 136, to the technical services for behavioral modification, to disbursements for anonymous consultants in psychology and pharmacology. Didn't take long before somebody connected the dots. The leak reached journalist Seymour Hersh in the New York Times. December 22nd, 1974, the headline hit the front page. It said, CIA conducted mind control experiments on U.S. citizens without consent. Well, the country, which is still reeling from President Nixon's downfall, literally froze and went cold. Americans had grown accustomed to secrets, but this was quite different. This wasn't wiretapping political opponents or lying about wars. This was slipping LSD to prisoners and patients and watching them dissolve and calling it science. Public didn't know the name MKUltra yet, but they shortly would. The outcry forced Congress to act. 1975, the Church Committee, formerly the U.S. Senate Select Committee to Studying Government Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, was formed, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The hearings dragged shadow into light. Testimonies were taken in packed rooms under oath. Former officials fidgeted. Their language was careful, sanitized. One said we sought methods of enhancing interrogation. Another said we explored avenues of influence. And then came the files. The surviving documents, those Gottlieb had managed to burn, told a story no euphemism could soften. Records of psychiatric torture, long-term hospitalizations, suicides marked as data loss. One paper outlined attempts to implant false memories. The other proposed using electroshock as a tool to disrupt structural thought. Well, the senators tried to mask their horror, but it leaked out. According to the church in a public address, we've turned our intelligence agencies into something far from democratic principles. If this government can do this to its own citizens, what can it do? Well, the American people asked the same question, and victims began to come forward. Few had fragments of memory, others had nothing but scars. Family members filed lawsuits, class action suits were filed, requests for information. Some received settlements, most received silence. Many were told there was no proof because the agency had destroyed it. Well, Frank Olson's family is one of the few to break through. After years of stonewalling, the government admitted his death had been part of a CIA program gone wrong. President Gerald Ford offered a rare in-person apology. The family received $750,000 in damages and a carefully worded statement of regret. But they never got the truth. Sidney Gottlieb retired quietly and moved to a farm in Virginia where he raised goats and practiced meditation. Never criminally charged. Refused most interviews. When asked in 1994 about MKUltra, he said only it was a different time. That's all they would say. He died in 1999. Allegedly of natural causes. By then, MKUltra had taken on a life of its own. It became a myth and metaphor. It slipped into movies and novels and conspiracy forums. For some, it was a symbol of how deep state power could rot. Others, it became a catch-all, an excuse, a shorthand for anything unexplainable. But behind the fog of speculation were real names, real lives. Found a patient in Montreal who could no longer remember her children. Or James, an inmate in Illinois, began hearing voices after being dosed for 12 consecutive days with LSD. Henry, a Harvard student who tried to claw his own eyes out. These weren't theories. These were casualties in a war that didn't exist. MKUltra didn't create mind control. It didn't produce super soldiers or psychic spies. What it did produce, what it perfected, was the art of erasure, not just of memories, but of accountability, of morality, of names and timelines and truth. Its legacy is not what it revealed, but what it concealed. Final government report concluded MKUltra had been ill-conceived, ethically inappropriate, and in violation of informed consent norms. The language was clinical and cold. The phrase crimes against humanity never appeared in any documents, but that's what it was. Those who lived through it knew better. They'd felt the wire in their skulls, the static behind their eyes, the paranoia that never left, the sense they'd been hollowed out by a government that didn't see them as citizens but as canvases. In 1977, during a final round of hearings, Senator Edward Kennedy asked former CIA officials, could this ever happen again? The man paused for a moment and said, well, not in the same way. Well, that wasn't really a comfort. And it wasn't really an answer. I think you could say it was probably a warning. Well, not to be outdone, as they came to light, some of the shenanigans the CIA was up to. Turns out the FBI had their own war going on activists. It's called COINTELPRO. In this particular case, the enemy wasn't overseas. Lived in the same neighborhood. It may have lived next door. Well, the first time this particular victim knew they were being watched, it wasn't a hunch, it was a pattern. This created an atmosphere where you didn't know who to trust, if there was anybody you could trust. The young lady in question's name was Denise. Last name has been redacted. Her mail arrived had been clearly tampered with. Phones clicked at odd intervals. Strangers parked across the street in idling sedans, reading newspapers, not ever turning the page. Well, Denise had joined the group she was a member of to make a difference, to organize, to educate, to resist. It wasn't radical, not in her mind, not at first. They conducted food drives and tenant meetings, and anti-war flyers were printed on donated paper. In North Philadelphia, that type of effort passed for revolution. The group didn't have a name in the beginning. It was just a circle, a loose circle of people. But by the late 1969, it had taken shape. Community self-defense, anti-imperialist, rooted in black liberation. A collective that believed the war in Vietnam was a distraction from the war at home against poverty and racism and surveillance. They taught kids to read, also how to recognize a police officer in plain clothes. Denise was 23 at the time, never held a gun in her life. She carried herself like somebody who might if she had to. The FBI had a file on her. Even in those early stages, it already showed 47 pages long. She didn't know that, of course. Nobody did. And that was the point. At Quantico and Langley, rooms full of agents had hunched over photographs and transcripts. They clipped newspaper clippings and wiretapped logs and intercepted letters. And they whispered in acronyms, SDS and BPP and SNCC and NOI. The enemy wasn't foreign. It was domestic. This particular threat was inside the country. J. Edgar Hoover had made it clear. Dissent was contagion. The cure was containment. In J. Edgar Hoover's mind, nobody was entitled to dissent. In 1956, he launched a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Purpose was simple: to disrupt, to discredit, to neutralize what the Bureau called subversive elements. In practice, it meant sabotage, psychological warfare, false letters, false friends. By the time Denise joined the movement, COINTELPRO had already burrowed into dozens of activist spaces, churches, colleges, bookstores, living rooms. Bureau didn't just monitor, they intervened, pitted members against each other, fake betrayals, seeded paranoia like weed killer and soy lord had cracked with distrust. And it was working. At first, the tension was subtle. Meetings grew colder, new members were greeted with suspicion. People changed their locks, and fewer folks laughed. Then came the break-ins. The group's community center was hit one night in December. Nothing was stolen, just paper scattered. Stack of donated coats torn and left in the sink. On the wall, somebody had written, "Who's the rat?" in spray paint. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses. The police arrived slowly, didn't take any notes, didn't seem to be particularly enthusiastic about investigating. And slowly they left. And after that, nobody trusted anybody fully. Well, there was another individual in the group by the name of Roy, ex-Marine who joined in January, all wide smiles and untraceable past. He brought weapons training, had contacts in Detroit. Knew too much, knew it too fast. Denise said later she didn't like him, but he brought resources, so they let him stay. Then came Marcia, who offered to handle press statements, then left mid-meeting one night and never came back. Then the phone call started. Distorted voices at 2 a.m, whispering names that hadn't been spoken aloud. Well, some members of the group wanted to disappear entirely. Others wanted to arm themselves. And the group fractured, exactly as COINTELPRO intended. An FBI memo dated March 3, 1970, a field agent from Philadelphia wrote, "Operation successful. Internal distrust at critical threshold. Target individual shifting towards self-destruction." And these memos were not exaggerating. People began to accuse each other of being disloyal. One man pulled a knife at a strategy session. Another vanished completely. Last seen walking through a black car he claimed was his cousin's. Denise stopped attending church, started sleeping with a knife under her pillow. But even through the fear of something held, they kept organizing. The food drives continued. The newsletters still went out, mimeographed on the same warring machine. But beneath the chaos, the fire hadn't gone out. It had just gotten quieter, angrier. Denise met with a few trusted members one night in a basement lit by a single bulb. And they literally spoke in code. They agreed to keep separate calendars, switch their meeting locations weekly. They didn't know who they could trust, but they knew that they were what they were fighting for. Well, none of them knew, not yet, was that a break was coming. Not from within, but from without. Across the state line in a small college town in Pennsylvania, a group of ordinary citizens, teachers, students, parents, were planning a burglary. They didn't carry badges or guns, just conviction. They're about to break into an FBI field office and expose the lie. Well, it was the night of March 8th, 1971. Highly publicized fight night. Muhammad Ali was going up against Joe Frazier in Madison Square Garden, and the country was glued to the radio. Bars were full, living rooms crowded, televisions flickering in black and white. In Media, Pennsylvania, sleepy town outside Philadelphia, the streets were quiet. And that was literally part of the plan. Inside a modest house on a narrow street, 8 people prepared for a crime that could put them behind bars for decades. They weren't revolutionaries, not in the way the FBI files imagined them. They were professors, graduate students, homemakers, and even a cab driver. White mostly, respectable, invisible, called themselves the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. The plan was impossibly ambitious. Break into the FBI satellite office during the fight, when security would be distracted. Steal as many files as possible and vanish without leaving a trace. They didn't have any military training, no insider help, just a lockpick, a crowbar, and nerves strung taut enough to hum. One of them, Keith Forsythe, stood by the office door that night, heart hammering. He had practiced unlocking similar doors for weeks, dismantling doorknobs in his apartment till the metal smelled like sweat. But this one was different. Hardened, had to abandon the tools and break in the old-fashioned way. He pried the door open with brute force. Inside there were metal cabinets that gleamed in the fluorescent dark. Rows and rows, hundreds of them. They worked quickly, stuffing everything into boxes and duffel bags, names, dates, photos, transcripts, law intelligence that had never seen daylight. No alarms were tripped, no police cruisers passed by, and the fight raged on across the country while the Bureau's secrets walked quietly out the front door. They drove back to their headquarters in silence, stunned at what they'd found. Back in Philadelphia, Denise had no idea the gears were turning. All she knew was that another comrade had been arrested on trumped-up charges, and somebody else had confessed to being an informant after a 3-day disappearance. The group she once trusted had become a crucible of whispers and locked doors. She noticed Dora acting strange. He never wrote things down, never really answered personal questions, always ready to escalate, push protest toward violence, suggest they confront police head-on, suggest they split from national organizations. They were creating the perfect wedge, don't you know? She confronted him once after a meeting. She asked, her voice sharp, you ever feel like you know too much about us? He smiled and he said, I pay attention. He vanished a week later, left no note. Somebody claimed they saw him getting into a car with government plates on it. When the files from media were mailed anonymously to journalists and civil rights groups in the weeks that followed, the truth came out like broken teeth. The name COINTELPRO, that had first been whispered, was now spoken aloud. Documents spelled it out clearly. Targeted surveillance, infiltration, disruptions of domestic political groups, deemed subversive. The operation had infiltrated the Black Panthers, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the anti-war organizations, Native American movements, women's liberation collectives, and student unions. They forged letters to incite breakups. They encouraged rival factions to attack each other. They mailed anonymous threats to activist families, even tried to blackmail Dr. Martin Luther King himself into committing suicide. When Denise saw her own group listed, her name was circled. An agent had reported she was influential, unwed, politically active, potentially a security threat. It made her stomach turn. In the community meeting days after the documents went public, somebody stood up and asked, how do we fight back if we can't even trust ourselves? Well, nobody had an answer to that. Bureau, of course, denied everything. Spokesman called the break-in a violation of national security. They said the files were taken out of context, but the papers are undeniable. Every name, every timestamp, every slur handwritten in the margins proved otherwise. What struck people wasn't just the scope. It was the intent. This wasn't surveillance. This was sabotage. One internal memo read: expose, disrupt, disdirect, discredit, otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist hate-type groups. But the groups they targeted weren't hate groups. They were teachers, organizers, mothers. They were citizens. Denise wept the night she read the file that named her best friend as a secondary target for destabilization. That friend had been found dead 2 years before in a river. Ruled a suicide, of course. Nobody believed in him. Now they didn't know what to believe. The FBI had infected the air. The very idea of truth had become suspect. But in Media, Pennsylvania, the citizens who had stolen the files disappeared. Nobody was arrested. Nobody came forward. They had done what the powerful feared most. They made the invisible visible. The fallout came slow, and then it came all at once. Once the COINTELPRO documents had spread, photocopied, smuggled, and analyzed by lawyers and journalists, the curtain was no longer just pulled back. It had been ripped off the curtain rod. Congress was forced to act. The public pressure was unrelenting. People wanted to know how deep it went, how many lives had been destroyed by quiet sabotage, how many marriages poisoned by fake letters, how many movements collapsed under weight not of their own making, but of careful orchestration. 1975, Senator Frank Church convened a Senate Select Committee to study government operations with respect to intelligence activities. That was a long name by any means. The hearings were historic. It became known as the Church Committee. Televised testimony gripped the nation. Men in suits shifted uncomfortably as senators let out passages from FBI memos with the cold clarity of fact. Audience members gasped. Staffers buried their faces in their hands. One document actually read like fiction, but it wasn't. It said, continue to disseminate derogatory information to the press to cause disruption in marriage plans of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Another one said, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. It watched, waited, poisoned wells, shattered friendships, and all of it had been done in secret. FBI Director Clarence Kelly, he had replaced J. Edgar Hoover after his death in 1972, faced the committee with a stiff posture and careful words. He condemned COINTELPRO as a relic of a different time, a mistake not in line with the Bureau's current values. But, unfortunately for him, nobody believed it was over. The program was officially disbanded in 1971, but its legacy seeped into the bones of the country. Denise watched the hearings on a small television, knees pulled up to her chest. She recognized names, phrases. She heard phrases once been spoken out loud at her meetings, parroted back in internal memos. She saw the shape of the trap they'd walked into. She wasn't angry anymore. She was just tired. At the closing of the hearing, Senator Church said the U.S. must not become a government in which intelligence operations are used to manipulate or subvert democratic processes. That's the nightmare we seek to avoid. But for many, the nightmare had already happened. No reparations were offered, yet no agents prosecuted. In classrooms, COINTELPRO was merely mentioned. But in the community centers and oral histories and the margins of Black, indigenous, and immigrant stories, it never left. The psychological scars ran deep. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk about another off-the-wall government program. Until then, Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.